The topic that I've been asked to deal with is not an easy one, and I have to tell you from the very beginning that I will approach the topic from a philosophical perspective, from a virtue ethicist one, and not from a neuroscientist one, because I'm not a neuroscientist. So although I have read, encountered, and reflected on some literature about that, my aim is to reflect with you about the likelihood of moral behavior, and specifically of virtuous behavior, and compare it with the neuroscientific studies about virtues. And first of all, I want to offer you a situation and a question. What are we more likely to do? Let's just imagine that 100 euros banknote falls from a man's pocket right in front of me, and the man doesn't realize it. And also suppose that I'm in short of money, I have a present to buy. What am I likely to do? My subsequent actions will vary, probably also a lot, according to my let me just say, provisionally moral structure, or on how am I disposed to behave. So will I take the money and give it back to the owner, or will I keep it for me? Or will I do nothing and just keep walking? And what if there were different variables? For example, would anything change in my behavior if the place were crowded and the owner would first disappear among the people? Would I run after him and try to look for the owner, or I would be reinforced in the idea that I can just keep the money? So my aim in this talk is suggesting that the likelihood of our moral actions is primarily virtue dependent, and therefore the acquired naturality of virtuous behavior is a significant source of predictable behavioral pattern outlining expected actions, so that I have called hypothesis of actions in a paper written some years ago, but I still agree with. And so to explore this thesis, I will consider basically some topics, subtopics, the likelihood of actions, of moral actions, with some sources that I chose to present. Then I will delve into the comparison between the neuroscientific prediction of moral actions and the virtue ethicist one specifically, trying to justify the fact that the main source of likely moral actions can be attributed to virtues system. And I will try to explain what I mean for hypothesis of action, and I will try to connect the idea of this hypothesis of action with the possibility of giving our consent or our veto to possible actions. So trying to identify freedom like an answer. And in this respect, I will also try to say that we have to conceive of freedom as a realistic freedom, as opposed to other ways of intending freedom as a pure or wide indeterminacy. So let's try to see this idea of likelihood. How an action can be likely. A human action, of course, can be likely for many reasons. It could be likely because, for example, it follows from a purely, almost purely instinctive reaction, like moving back one's hand after touching something hot, or could be expected because it is almost automatic, or very much expectable in a situation to act in a certain way. For example, when a child shows disappointment because her gift box is completely empty. But we could also have very likely actions that are simply non-moral habits, like a person who's used to putting her keys in her left pocket. The notion of likelihood I'm introducing does not refer to those situations, but basically to moral actions conceived as those in which goals, aims, ends, general values, and eventually principles are involved. And a first way of explaining why moral action can be likely is reason. The idea of grounding action likelihood, moral action likelihood in abstract thought or reasoning stems from the assumption that for humans, at least, more rational means more likely. This is a fundamentally Kantian perspective that might work in some domains, maybe moral discourse, maybe moral language, but in ethical practice it is quite common to experience a contrast between moral knowledge and actual behavior. And of course, we might give a lot of examples of that, but we might encounter a person being very much aware of the fact that in our daily diet, we assume too much sugar. And so being very much concerned with the idea that in the choice between eating vegetables or candies and cakes, there must be good reasons to at least to a certain level, a certain percentage, decrease the level of sugar and increase the level of vitamins and other nutrients. But although the person might be very much convinced and sure about this thought and this conviction, then when it comes to decide what to do, the behavior might be very different from the rational conceivement in the first place. So between understanding and acting, there might be a difference, and this is not that rare. And also, sometimes we think about rational as a calculative skill. In all the different variants of the trolley problems, for example, we have seen many times how the most rational behavior meant as the balancing of pros and cons is not the most probable behavior, because we might have been pulled towards another choice by different kinds of motivations. There is also the possibility of interpreting the rational probability of a moral action as a reasonability. And this is more interesting, I think, and more, I would say, solid, more sound as an opportunity to see the likelihood of moral actions, because actually it is true, it is undoubtedly true that reasonability is a criterion to detect the likelihood. For example, we develop very frequently moral judgment that follow this criterion. We develop a moral certainty that our longtime neighbor is not a murderer, that the food at the restaurant we often go is not poisoned, that our new colleague has not given us a fake name. And the reason for these certainties is clear. We know that generally speaking, people do not kill, hurt, or lie all at once. In other words, we can say that if we don't have specific evidence for doubting, we tend to attribute people the most reasonable moral behavior in a given situation due to the overall reasonability of humans. However, this is not enough to say that we have found the most likely way of behaving morally, because there is no real compel or necessity to go through this path, and also there might be variables and situations that change this progression and these consequences. We can say then that while it is questionable that the likelihood of a moral action can be determined by reason only, the overall rationality and reasonability of actions might belong to a different way of orienting our behavior, which has to do with virtues that in fact give reason and account very well for reasonability and also for rational, if it's not a utilitarian, quantitative way of calculating advantages and disadvantages. Another possible source of likely moral action is obviously emotion. Emotional reactions might be invoked to explain the likelihood of moral actions because it is apparent to anybody that the intensity of our inclinations and passions can often predict our behavior, and consequently we might identify emotionally induced actions as fundamental occurrences of likelihood of actions. And like any experience, emotions contribute, of course, to generating moral action, although emotions can have different interpretation, and specifically they might be considered perceptually as overwhelming forces physically arising and bringing along necessary reactions. And according to this theory, the emotional level might be interpreted as instinctive and many times also as unreliable. And the likelihood of behaviors that are induced by this way of interpreted emotions can encounter difficulties in real life practice, because we can exert self-control on emotions. Of course, we can give different priorities in expressing emotions, but also in balancing emotional and non-emotional behavior. And we can also use our will to follow external rules or internal rules that maybe go in a different way compared with the emotional, spontaneous, or physical reaction. But there's also another way of intending emotion, which is not so much related to this overwhelming force, and it's much more involved with an integrated cognitive function of emotions that actually would enter into the process of knowledge and morality. And this view, of course, is already implicit in the Aristotle's connection between virtues and emotions that we all know very well. And it even seems that especially when he talks about moral virtues, he actually refers to the way of dealing with emotions in this both intermediate and best way, which is characteristic of virtue. So we can say that according to this perspective, virtue has to do with the emotional likelihood of actions, but with a strong responsibility in that, a very deep way of interacting with the emotional level. Virtue could precisely be a privileged instrument to cultivate emotion. In summary, it can be maintained that emotions are important in action probability, but this does not exclude and actually might very well involve virtues, which some studies have interpreted as emotion regulators. So, so far we have seen that two sources of the likelihood of moral actions as reason and emotion have some good point, but they're not enough to really give reason and give a picture, a whole picture of the likelihood of moral actions. And also there's this possibility that virtues enter into those sources interacting with them in a very successful way, and maybe justifying and explaining them much better than they can just by themselves. The other possible source, which is very challenging, is the fact that our brain, so our brain structures, could be so strong and able to influence and to preview what's going to happen, that in fact we do morally also what the brain makes us to do. So this is the very much well-known and studied perspective of the neural predetermination that assumes or hypothesizes that we have a sort of pre-moral level which is already sketched and built into our brains and would induce in a sometimes necessary way what we want to do. And of course, I'm referring here to the huge number of experiments, of the Libet-like experiments, starting from the Benjamin Libet's one in 1999 that was, very shocking within the scientific community, and all the way along throughout all the studies, for example, the Sun and colleagues one. And what they suggest is that there is a very high probability of performing certain also moral actions as opposed to others that have their definite source in our brains. So it would be basically acted by our neural system, which can display our imminent choices several seconds or minutes sometimes before we become aware of them. Although Libet-like experiments, especially the first part of them, consider oversimplified actions and do not pretend to explain moral life as a whole, some derived neuroethical model jumped from a neural explanation of human behavior to ethical theory, interpreting those experiments as a threat to free will. And the Sun and colleagues example is one of those. There are, of course, difficulties also in saying that the brain system is a reliable source of the likelihood of actions and moral actions specifically. For example, the abstract setting in which all those experiments and correlations are stated, are discovered. The fact that usually it's very difficult to grade, to see the grades and the nuances in the different reactions compared to the intentions and the actions. And all the experiments cannot take into account the big variety of contexts in which real moral life is performed. There have been, to tell the truth, some attempts to put in a, I would say, coordinated relationship, neural correlates in the brain and virtue ethics and virtue structure. And specifically, some of them have tried to address the challenge according to which also virtues would be nothing more than something that has already been decided by the brain with a more, freedom-oriented perspective. And in fact, we can see that these studies said that virtues could be, like any other voluntary and aware kind of action, a mechanism barely involved in our consciousness. Probably Paul Churchland was the first trying to connect virtue acquisition and brain structure, because he said that virtues are a complex neurological network allowing, the acquisition of skills like social perception, social reflection, imagination, reason, and so on. There would be an innate part that he calls prototypical space, which would determine or predetermine our virtue capability. Then the input of experience, of education, of social values can generate a more individual, a more subjective output, system of outputs that, when are stable, can be called virtues in the strict sense. So his explanation tries to give an account of the brain setting and modifications that are connected to virtue acquisition through experience and not just to neural systems. But I think that in the end, if I understood right his thought, the possibility of having an influence from the outside, from the experience, from free will, is not that that strong. I mean, it's not so consistent, so significant in comparison with the innate structure. And then we have virtues. Also, virtues can be seen as an important, as a very evident way of explaining likely moral behavior, because by definition they are acquired dispositions towards the perceived good, which means that we find ourselves through virtues inclined towards an end which is perceived and identified as a good one. And this acquisition, this acquired disposition, again, by definition, in the Aristotelian perspective, gives us that specific spontaneity, or also acquired, I would say, naturality, which is very close to what we can observe in very much according to an acquired disposition toward a perceived good. For example, let us think about a situation regarding problems at work. A person has big difficulties in working in a certain environment. She cannot stand the idea of entering her office, of sitting at her desk, of facing the frustrations that she has to experience every day. So she asks a psychotherapist, and during a session, she's invited to imagine a situation of a box match in which she has to think about what happens during a match. There's the attacking part, of course, but there's also the resisting part. The people involved in a match has to get ready, has to strengthen their muscles in order to become resistant. So they don't just have to see the problem, to face in an active, attacking way, but they also have to be resistant, to be, if you want, resilient, which is much more common to say nowadays. So the therapist tells C to use this metaphor in her work situation, and she develops a will, first of all, the intention to be resilient, to be stronger, to manage the pain generated by her workplace, the fear of going there again and again. And she starts exercising her endurance whenever she felt discouraged and wishful to run away. And progressively, she gains enough courage to sustain that situation autonomously. And in the end, she becomes courageous enough to feel her perception of that pain, of that fear, uh, as well as other forms of pain and fear in different situations, but they are not felt and reacted in the same way anymore. Eventually, she feels confident in the face of adversities thanks to this acquired virtue of courage. This is just a very simple example to explain how a likely behavior can become substantial and concrete when a virtue is acquired. And this happens in a way that goes in the direction of the first two ways of conceiving likely actions, because it's in accordance to reason, and it cooperates in emotion regulators. In addition, the virtues are embodied in everyday common experience, but they are also spiritual in the sense that their moral level goes beyond the mechanism of actions. And it might be neurally detectable. This is the the thing that we have to see now. But for now, we have seen together that virtuous action can include in their functioning and can explain reason and especially reasonability of actions, emotional level of actions, and they might be also helpful in explaining the neural correlates that many studies have been detecting when observing and reflecting upon free acts. But then we have two problems that we want to address. Are virtues newly detectable, or this is just an abstract idea that has no correspondence in reality? Second, which is the same question, but on the other, in a deeper way, the fact that they are detectable, okay, but they can also change the brain. Can they be influencers of the brain? So the direction is reverted compared with the many neuroscientist studies saying that virtues is a consequence of the brain. Could we say the opposite, that the brain or neural correlates and activations are a consequence of virtue acquisition? And then if could we find ourselves within a situation in which the determinism, so the denial of freedom, is not a brain's fault, but it's a virtue's fault? Okay, very simply, we can say that as for the first situation, the first question is, are they really detectable? Yes, sorry. We can say that virtues seem to have a significant neural correlates and psychological effects. And there are many studies that have identified specific areas that are connected with moral behavior and virtue behavior. Of course, we cannot go that far in the reading of these data, because what they can see are some connections that seem to be very much oriented to our moral behavior, but it's not a correspondence. One region, one circuit, one virtue. For example, in this study of 2009, the authors proved that the amygdala and the limbic system, that are responsible for emotion and the prefrontal cortex, that are responsible for cognitive processes, are activated under the impulse of virtuous behavior. But what is more important and more interesting in our reflection here is that not only virtuous behavior and virtuosity can be detected, also on a neural, possibly on a neural level, but they might also change the brain. They may cause changes, non-permanent changes in the brain. And in fact, the modifications in the perception of emotions originated by virtues, together with the flexible structure of our minds, suggest that virtue acquisition induces stable, although non-permanent, new synaptic connections. In other words, it seems that the changes in behavior induced by virtues might change the brain too. And this might happen in a non-permanent way, obviously, but not that obviously, because of the possibility of losing or weakening, as well as of further strengthening our virtues. Some examples of specific virtues, just two of them. The virtue of compassion. Wang and colleagues have been studying compassion, and they say that the brain of those who have been taught compassion, who have learned compassion, showed changes in neural activity and specifically increased engagement of neural systems implicated in understanding the suffering of other people, in executive and emotional control, and in rewarding processing. And these changes were apparent in neural responses when these subjects were shown images of suffering. The levels of neural activation were greater in subjects who had learned compassion compared as opposed to the others. Another example is from the phronetic possibility of interaction with the brain in a very recent study of Hye-Min Han using neuroimaging, neurostimulation, and neurofeedback. He discovered that and also controlled and gathered within literature that there are brain circuits associated with morality and virtues, especially that area, that part called default mode network. Which suggests that there might be a unique neural level pattern of moral functioning, although this is not restricted to specific brain region. And besides that, he says that the trainings and interventions aimed at virtue acquisition have induced changes in structure and functioning at the neural level, which means that virtue habituation involves functional and structural changes in the brain. This is consistent with this idea that I've mentioned very quickly before, namely the fact that well-established virtues generate a spontaneous behavior, providing a sort of second nature for the owner. And this acquired naturality of the virtues might seem a very reasonable source of predictable behavior patterns outlined in this hypothesis of action. What are these hypotheses of actions? That can be defined as action, an action or a series of actions that a subject with a number of virtues or with the virtuosity, if you want, is expected to perform in a given situation. And I call them hypotheses because they appear hypothetical in the possibilities of action of the subject. That is, they are a sort of virtual starting point for moral particular acts. Their hypothetical nature makes them given as probabilities, namely what we are expected to do without efforts. That has to be confirmed in real actions. This allows us to go to the last question, if you remember this one. Are we into a sort of new way of determinism that can be called a neural, a virtuous determinism? Well, I think that this question is not trivial. Because on the one hand, it's almost obvious to say that, of course, a person whose virtues, who develops, acquires, and cultivates virtues is a free person because he has this will to become virtuous and employs it. But on the other hand, also if we look at the Aristotelian perspective, I think that this is probably one of the weakest points in the Aristotelian perspective. According to Aristotle, of course, we need uh, an intelligent structure in order to become virtuous. But there's a privileged period of our life in which we can become virtuous. After that, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible. Therefore, the person who's not virtuous, who's a non-virtuous person, might be continent, but it's very difficult that a person who has not developed a virtuous personality, if you want, or structure, becomes virtuous afterwards. For the same reason, it's very difficult that a person who has acquired a full-blown virtue loses this virtue and goes back to an unvirtuous behavior and moral structure. So it's not trivial to say that virtuosity is not deterministic. But I think that although the spontaneity and the effortless practice of moral good behavior for the virtuous person resembles determinism, is indeed very, very different from that. And in fact, can solve the challenges to freedom posed by neuroscience. Of course, we have to distinguish, first of all, and I don't want to spend much time on that, natural tendencies and virtues. This is something that also Aristotle very carefully does in the Nicomachean when he says that there are big differences between natural tendencies, although they seem they are virtue-like. They don't require time to become stable. They don't need right reason. They're not always voluntary. Whereas virtues need nurturance, are acquired over time, are voluntary, although spontaneous, agree with reason, regulate emotion, and so on. But still, this could be also interpreted as by the fact that you have to acquire virtues in a certain way, but once acquired, that's it. Han says that the experimental data about brain networks show that there is not an identity of spontaneous behavior and determinism, but the connections between spontaneous activation of cerebral areas and our choice is something different. So we go to the last part, and also almost close to the end. We can say that although virtuous behavior is spontaneous, although it might be, I have no problems in admitting that it can be detected at the neural level. It can change our brain systems, and because of the correlates that it induces, it can be predictive of actions and not the other way around. But this doesn't mean we are compelled to perform our virtue-induced actions, although we are very likely to do that. So according to our virtues and eventually vices ethical structure, we have hypotheses of actions that we have to face day by day. We can, however, depart from those. We can deny our consent to them, or we can accept them by giving the consent. And I want to suggest that freedom, at the very core of it, is precisely this concept or denial. It's always possible for the agent to depart from this more likely virtue-induced action, but her deviation from the virtuous behavioral pattern are rare. Therefore, and this is the very last part, our hypotheses of actions are submitted to one's veto and consent power, because we are inclined to persist in our virtues as long as we continue to give our consent, but we can also oppose our veto. This, of course, implies a shift from an idea of freedom as an indeterminate a place of indeterminacy, more or less complete, to a more realistic way of intending it. Some years ago, Cooklet and Flowers have introduced a notion of realistic virtues, saying that we might think about ideal virtues, but what we encounter in real experience are usually not ideal virtues, but realistic virtues, which are not the perfection of the virtues, but are real virtues, virtues that are real and realistic. And this is what allows also the acquisition and stabilization of specific threats, if you want to call them like that, that can be very deeply involved and structured in our brain, but also in our mind and personality, to the point that some authors like Warren Snow and Wright, but also Cooklet and Flowers, have attributed those traits also to some personality reading in a psychological sense, eventually using, as in the Warren Snow and Wright case, the whole trait theory. So to end, we can depict in very generally the functioning of our moral actions, of our likely moral actions, saying that the subject S is exposed to virtues mainly through exemplars, and this means that the main source of virtues is not primarily thinking or learning, but seeing virtues. But this is another story. And once virtues are acquired, however it happens, they are constantly evoked in daily experiencing, depicting a set of consistent and likely actions as possible behavioral answer to these experiences, facts, events, or even thought. The probable action or actions that could be seen in the brain, if any, could be a sort of preliminary brain activation, but in fact is only a probability of action, which might become real in action one if our consent and veto power generates an affirmative answer, namely our consent. Otherwise, our consent and veto power might refuse the most probable action, so with non-action one, and consequently activate another, more unlikely, but still possible, action two, to which the subject might give her consent instead. And while action one flows more spontaneously from the subject's virtue setting, or eventually the vicious one, non-action one, therefore action two, involves a deliberative process, which is doesn't have to be a non-virtuous reaction, could be a differently virtuous reaction, invoking another virtue or something like that. Okay, I think I have to go to conclude, and we might maybe have time in the Q&A to connect this way of interpreting the relationship between scientific account of virtues to virtue ethics. But now I just want to conclude, just summarizing what I hope to have shared with you, which is the fact that the likelihood of our moral actions is primarily virtue dependent, that the acquisition of virtues can change our brain structure, generating neural correlates which might be activated by hypotheses of actions, and that our responses to hypothesis of actions elicits our consent and veto power, which reveals the realistic dimension of freedom while preserving and strengthening, if possible, our self-determination. Thank you very much for your attention.